So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking it out. I know it's been a long day for you with lots of learning and your minds are full and you're willing to stick it out for another hour here. Hopefully it'll be educational but also fun. And I feel privileged to have this opportunity to speak with you today about a topic that I find very important. I know that most people that enter the fields that you've entered into do so because you want to be of service to the communities in your lives and to the children. And what I hope to do today is provoke further conversations regarding how we can advance our work by connecting more effectively with each other. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to begin with a poem. It's a poem that a friend of mine wrote who's an artist and an author in San Diego, California. And it's based on a true life experience that she had. And it's a little raw, so I want to warn you about that. It's a little raw. It speaks to certain things that hit pretty hard. So I want you to be aware of that as you listen to it and listen to the extent that you're comfortable. It's called Benediction for the Intruder. Bless the man at the foot of my bed at 3 a.m. Bless his unfired gun. Bless my new policy of locked doors. Bless the country he devastated. Bless his training, the men who broke him. Bless the blood on their uniforms. Bless those who died because they were born in the wrong part of the world. Bless the man with a gun who was once a boy raped by his foster father. Bless the reservation he was born on. Bless the tattered flag over their taken land. Bless the man who raped his mother to make him. Bless the drugs she thought would save her. Bless the gang he thought would save him. Bless his first crime. Bless the judge who, instead of a sentence, gave him a gun to carry in the name of the flag that was never his mother or his land or for saving. Bless my instinct. Bless my fool decision to leap up out of bed and embrace him. Bless the words I wept, you can't hurt me. Bless that somewhere in his heart he heard. I like to read this poem when I speak about compassion for several reasons. First, it's pretty powerful and emotional, and it can't help but capture our attention both in our hearts and in our minds. I don't read it as a prescription, however. Compassion is more complex than any single act, no matter how profound that act might be. And I'm going to speak more about that later. But it does speak to certain truths about compassion and certain truths about the contradictory but complementary dimensions of life. So one way of describing life is as an intersection of body and spirit, or in scientific terms, the intersection of energy and matter, which is where we get life. Now, the horizontal line of the body represents the truth of our individuality, of our separation, of our uniqueness. And it highlights the body's need for survival. It's driven, the emotion that drives it is primarily fear. And fear literally shifts the brain into survival mode. Now, the vertical line focuses on the truth of our interconnectedness with life. That beyond the manifest world, there's a deeper reality of unity. Physicist David Bohm referred to this as the implicate order. It's powered by positive emotional states, primarily love, and it moves us towards growth and adaptation. It opens up the brain to higher order functioning. It opens up cells so that they can heal and grow. Now, both of these dimensions are important because they arise out of our very nature, but they serve different functions in life. Mythologist Joseph Campbell suggested 2 laws of life arise out of these dimensions. He referred to the second law of life as the law of survival, the body's need for survival, and it arises out of our experience of separation. It creates closed states for the purpose of protection. The first law of life arises out of the experience of unity, and it requires open states for adaptation, growth, and change. Now the problem is, there we go. Did it move? Yes. Now, the problem is that we've privileged the second law of life, that we focus so much on individuality that we've lost sight of some important truths. It's no surprise that what's in it for me has become the leading question of our time. It's no surprise that in 2/3 of the world's countries, the gap between rich and poor has grown tremendously over the last several decades. And this, in essence, has created, I think, the fundamental neuroses of our time. That is, our disconnection from reality and from the challenges that we face involves our experience of fragmentation. Fragmentation in our relationship to ourselves, to each other, and to the world in general. Even how we receive information these days is frequently fragmented. It comes in bits and bytes that are often without context, without history, without an understanding of our abilities to respond or our responsibilities to respond. Now, the psychological response to fragmentation is fear and certainty. And fear and certainty both work against change. They work against growth, against adaptability, against flexibility. And certainty, if you're wondering, manifests as righteousness and fundamentalism, right? And we shouldn't just worry about other people's fundamentalism. Because what happens to us when our hearts and minds freeze around a point of view about a person or a situation? And then we justify our actions on the basis of that frozen point of view. So certainty is not confidence. Certainty is ego's response to fear. Certainty works against excellence, against change, against creativity, because with certainty there is no more questions. There's no more exploration. There's nothing new. It should come as no surprise then that certain politicians who don't have creativity and want to get elected will use what to get elected? Fear, which, by the way, also makes us dumb. And I mean that literally, right? So what happens in a state of fear? The blood vessels in your frontal cortex constrict, pushing metabolic activity into your midbrain, where your midbrain then hijacks your intelligence, right? And so you can become very creative about how you can be certain, right? And so you can see how these politicians, who will remain nameless, but I'm sure if you've watched the US primaries, you probably have seen some of this, right? Use their own version of fundamentalism in discussion about other people's fundamentalism, right? So the problem is fragmentation. The antidote is connection. In fact, we're actually hardwired to connect with each other. Human beings' primary response to both growth opportunities and to threat is social engagement. It's reaching out to another person, to a people. It is only when this fails, because of abuse or neglect, that we revert to survival functions, to fight, flight, or freeze reactions. Connection is essential. It's how the brain works. Brain integration really involves the connection of different aspects of the system. And this actually leads to a better brain that leads to better health, to more flexibility, to more creativity. It's how the universe works. The new science highlights the non-fragmentary nature of the universe, in which energy manifests in the form of matter, life, and information that is mixed, intermingled, interconnected, entangled. It's how creativity works in general, in the arts, in the sciences, in business. Creativity is really combinatorial. It involves connecting ideas that are already out there in new ways. It's remixing. It's mashing up all this information to get something new, right? It's about people connecting with each other. That's how creativity occurs. And brain integration, when it's made visible, looks like compassion. And this is according to Dan Siegel, who's one of the founders of the field of interpersonal neurobiology. And that same research field shows that compassion actually promotes brain integration, which, as I said earlier, is essential for well-being, for flexibility and creativity. So compassion is the way. Compassion literally takes us out of ourselves and connects us to others by its nature, right? Compassion is about connecting with others, stepping outside of our own ego. But compassion is a social emotion, right? Compassion is about doing something in the world, doing something that matters, creating positive change, ending suffering. And so it inherently ties us to the horizontal dimension of life. It's the bridge between the two worlds. But what is compassion? When I do smaller workshops with people, I usually ask people to tell me and share with me the images that pop into their head when they think about compassion. And I'm sure right now you've had some images pop into your head as well, right? What images pop into your head about what compassion is? What do you see in your mind? Mother Teresa. And do you see Mother Teresa doing something? What do you see her doing? Helping underprivileged people. Other images? Are they similar to that? Right? The images that we usually see of compassion are these soft and gentle images. Now, I did a Google search on images of compassion, and 3 kind of themes showed up. The first theme was the heart, right? Compassion is of the heart. Like there were hearts everywhere, right? And there are many cultures, and actually all cultures, I think, in many ways, that believe that the seat of compassion and love is in the heart, right? There's a story from Richard Davidson, who's a neurologist who was studying meditation and compassion meditation. And he was putting the caps with the EEG electrodes on these monks, and they all started to laugh. And they were wondering, why are you laughing? Is it a funny cap? They said, no, because you're looking for compassion in the wrong place. It's not up here, it's over here, right? So Liz's poem as well, Liz Huerta, who wrote that poem that you listened to at the beginning, right? The last line, somewhere in his heart he heard, right? This is where the seat of compassion is. The second group of images is the Mother Teresa-like image, right? The image that you most likely have in your mind. This image of someone caring for another person, lifting someone up, right? Consoling, being with, right? And this is, of course, a very popular and common image, and it makes sense, right? Now, the third group of images, they were a little different. I mean, they were the same and different. They were inspiring in some ways, but kind of funny in other ways. At first, they made me think of Disney. But the best way of describing them is as utopian. It's really the zebra and the lion hugging it out, right? They hug out their differences. They're no longer enemies. They're good buddies now, right? And all of these images, to some extent, really represent a truth about compassion. But at the same time, seeing compassion in this kind of simplistic, unidimensional way probably makes some of you want to gag, right? And the reason for that is that you probably don't always think about compassion in this way. Or maybe if you see yourself occasionally in your life as a zebra surrounded by one or more lions, you're probably not thinking about hugging it out with a lion, right? You're probably thinking something more like this, right? Or if you're lucky, maybe it looks like this. Or better yet, maybe like this, right? The problem is when we see compassion in a simplistic way, in a unidimensional way, it creates some problems for us. One of the problems it creates is psychological. It creates compassion fatigue, burnout. And let's face it, sometimes when you want to hug that lion, the lion's not going to hug back. He might go for the jugular, right? And so it creates a sense of victimization. And because of this, it can lead to avoidance, where people will avoid experiencing compassion because they see it as a sign of weakness. And of course, this is a big problem when leaders, people in positions of leadership, will avoid being compassionate because they see it as a sign of weakness. And this often leads to a third problem, which is an erosion of ethics. In other words, what happens is we then decide that compassion is really only available for people on the inside, right? And not for people on the outside. And of course, this leads us right back to fundamentalism. And we're back to the same problem we had at the beginning. So, let me go back here. The question is, if you forgive, do you automatically have to become a doormat? If you open yourself, your heart, to the suffering of the kids in your classroom, do you have to collapse into grief and despair? Now, these questions made me think of some research done by Adam Grant that's in a completely different field, but I think would add some insight for us. Adam Grant looked at who are the best and worst performers in the field of medicine, engineering, and sales. And he looked at three categories of people. Givers, the people we might consider compassionate. They give of themselves, no strings attached. Right? And then there are the takers. These are the people we love to hate. I call them psychological vampires, right? You know, in the worst case. The best case, they're just mosquitoes, right? But they suck everything dry, but they give nothing back. And then there's the matchers, which represents the majority, right? They follow the principle of reciprocity, right? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. They try to seek equilibrium. Now, interesting, first of all, that the result was the same in all three fields, okay? So, by a show of hands, how many people believe that the givers fell on the bottom, were the worst performers? Okay, nobody. The takers. The matchers. A lot of you have no opinions whatsoever. All right. Well, it turns out the givers fell at the bottom. Does this surprise you? Now, who fell at the top? Who are the best performers? Everybody thinks it was the takers. No, it wasn't. It was also the givers. So this is interesting, right? What distinguishes successful givers from failed givers? Two things. One, successful givers had boundaries. They knew that life is energy, and that when their energy is low, they have to put some limits on giving. And when the energy goes up, they can give again. So they had boundaries. And the second is they looked for win-win scenarios. They looked for ways of giving that actually raised everyone, including themselves, up. Right? My interpretation of this is that they saw themselves in the circle of care. Right? So compassion isn't just for others. Compassion is universal. And so it must include self-compassion. Right? And so they didn't become martyrs and really just allow themselves to be drained dry. They actually were able to rise and bring everyone else up with them. Right? So this is important because compassion then is not just soft and gentle, right? It's more complex than that. It also has boundaries, right? Compassion has boundaries. It includes oneself. And on top of that, compassion can sometimes be sharp. Sharp like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting open the body to remove a tumor, right? And compassion can also be bold and strong, right? As in the nonviolent resistance movements, right? Very bold, very strong, and very courageous, right? Compassion can be very courageous, as in the restorative justice movements, right? I don't know if you're familiar with the healing circles and restorative justice circles, but I mean, from my perspective, they're one of the most amazing things, right? Because what they're doing is they're dealing with a fundamental issue of fragmentation, that is a crime, right? Perhaps even a violent crime has been committed. which is fundamentally an act of fragmentation, right? And instead of creating further fragmentation, further separation through a pure, punitive measure, which, by the way, the science shows punishment alone tends to increase the likelihood of reoffenses, not decrease them. Instead of doing that, what they've done is they've created an opportunity to heal and to mend the fracturing. Now, if you've ever seen them, if you've ever seen healing circles and restorative justice circles, they are not just soft and gentle, right? Certainly they involve caring, right? And certainly they can be soft and they can be gentle, but they can also be very, very tough, right? And take an immense amount of courage, right? So I want you to understand that compassion is more complex. And compassion, for example, will compel me as a mental health professional to help people in society face their shame, their traumas, their phobias, rather than allowing silence to continue, right? Letting people off the hook, which will make people feel better, make society feel better in the short term, but nothing changes from that perspective. So compassion also compels us to step into the silence and speak up against problems in the world. So what I'm talking about here is a compassion that is intelligent. Right? And intelligent compassion does involve that universal idea of connection, that we become connected with others. And it also involves action, right? This desire to promote life-affirming change, right, to end suffering. But it also involves skillful action, right? Doing the right thing at the right time in the right place, right? And the right thing, the act that promotes life-affirming change, the act that moves towards ending suffering, might not be soft and gentle. It might be sharp or bold and courageous. Yes, it will always involve caring and connection, but it will manifest in a way that's appropriate to the situation, and it will happen by being in the right state, by being in a compassionate state. And this isn't just hyperbole. Science actually backs me up here, right? So I'd like to take a few moments to talk a little bit about the science of compassion. First, compassion is actually an emotional competency. It improves with practice. There are neurological correlates that go along with compassion that change as people practice and engage in acts of compassion. Functional magnetic resonance imaging scans and studies show that compassion can be learned in the same way as playing a musical instrument or practicing a sport, right? Scans reveal changes in the brain circuits as people practice, as people engage in these experiences. So the research suggests that individuals, from children who may be engaged in bullying to adults prone to depression, and society in general could benefit from learning these practices. And it's also important to recognize that compassion is, in a sense, self-rewarding, that it's actually pleasurable. It releases oxytocin, which is that bonding hormone, the bonding neurotransmitter, which is also released during childbirth, right? During breastfeeding, during sex, right? It's the way we connect with each other, right? And compassion actually regulates our physiology, and it increases our capacity for problem solving. It actually makes us smarter. It activates the prefrontal cortex, allowing for adaptation and change. In the field of interpersonal neurobiology, it's been shown that the more connected people feel, the more open to change they become. And that connection activates more advanced neural circuitry that support prosocial behavior, learning, and growth. In business research, we see that groups that are most effective can be identified as being other-focused instead of self-focused. They showed greater attunement to each other and to their environments, and therefore they dealt with complexity and change significantly more effectively. Research on students in schools that were taught, where the students were taught these practices, showed improved self-control. They paid attention to class. They regulated their own emotions more effectively. They related to others better. One study showed that third graders' capacity to relate to others was a better predictor of future academic success than their academic achievement at grade 3. Right? So this is critical. It actually changes our brain and makes us smarter and allows us to solve problems more effectively in life. Compassion also helps us enjoy better mental and physical health. It speeds up recovery from disease. It may even, some studies show, lengthen our lifespan, which is, nice. It definitely buffers us against stress, tones down the sympathetic nervous system, activates the parasympathetic. And it decreases rates of anxiety and depression. And anxiety and depression are fundamental psychological symptoms of fragmentation. They're symptoms of disconnection. Compassion also builds alliances, rapport, relationships. And this is fundamental. One thing that we know is that one of the most important factors in the use of violence and aggression is the experience of fragmentation. It's the experience of disidentifying with others, right? This is why we come up with abusive names and propaganda to use against the other, right? We create them as an other. Whereas compassion actually builds connection and makes aggression significantly less likely to happen. It also keeps people connected to resources. So by being connected to resources, they're less likely to drop out and they're more likely to benefit. Right? Compassion also allows us to see people holistically, to see all of who they are, both the good and the bad, but to see it all and to acknowledge all of it. And then people can be seen, can experience themselves as being seen. And that's one of the most powerful things that can happen to a person, is to be fully seen. Right? And I hope, and I'll share with you a story in a little while that I hope represents this. And if this isn't enough yet to convince you, then compassion also gives you a better chance of finding and keeping a long-term mate. Right? One study showed that the most important characteristics for both men and women for a long-term mate was kindness. Right? So it's very important. But I also want you to understand that intelligent compassion indicates that we need to be clear about accountability. Intelligent compassion has both warmth but also clarity, sees things the way they are, and is willing to get into the muck and deal with reality as it is. So if I look at one of the fields that I specialize in, which is the area of domestic violence, when I'm working with men who've acted violently towards their spouse, where they've acted in controlling and abusive ways, I can recognize that they are suffering even as they are causing suffering. And that recognition, that compassion, allows me to focus on keeping them accountable, because it's only through accountability that we end the suffering for everyone, right? But it also takes us another step further, because now we can also invite that person to be part of the solution rather than just seeing them as part of the problem. And that can be immensely powerful. And in fact, the research here also backs me up, because it turns out that in states of self-compassion and context of compassion, people are more likely to take responsibility for their actions. And in context of shame and guilt, where the threat response system activates, they're more likely to repeat problems and patterns. And this is true, by the way, for all people. If you're having an issue with procrastination, you go into guilt and shame, you're more likely to procrastinate again. You activate self-compassion, you're less likely to procrastinate. Right? It's true around keeping your exercise plan or your diets, whatever the case may be. Compassion increases the likelihood of responsibility and decreases the likelihood of perpetuating the problem. But I also want you to understand that it needs to be authentic. It needs to be real. We are actually connected to each other in deep and meaningful ways. We have this kind of neural emotional Wi-Fi, right? Where we actually are entangled with each other, right? Both the fields of neurocardiology and neurology have demonstrated this. And so at a subconscious level, at a right brain to right brain level, we actually can sense each other's experience, right? And you can call it a vibe if you want, but that's what it is. We can actually sense each other's experiences. One example of this is mirror neurons. How many people are familiar with mirror neurons? Right? A few of you are, right? And mirror neurons do exactly what they say they do. I mean, what the name suggests, which is, they mirror the perceived experience of another person. But what they're experiencing is the information at a subconscious level that a person is leaking out. Because we leak out our real emotional states, right? You can smile and pretend to smile and say the right words, but you can still leak out contempt and disdain that you might have for someone. And that person's mirror neurons will activate that contempt and disdain and prepare them in their premotor cortex to act from that perspective, right? In close proximity, it's been shown that the heart rate variability of one person will affect the neurological function of another person, right? Again, we're entangled with each other. We're connected with each other. So compassion, for it to work, has to be authentic. And so you should ask yourself the question, should you be in a room with children, with adults, with parents, with stakeholders, if you only have contempt or disdain for them, right? It's a difficult question. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to become perfect all of a sudden. We all have an inner tyrant, right? The part of us that becomes righteous because we feel like we're right? That's not the problem. The problem is when we're unaware of it, and then we don't address it and deal with it. Because if we become aware of it, then we can change things. We can change our relationship to ourselves and then how we deal with people. We can step out of that righteousness. So let's talk about ways that we can promote compassion. First of all, we need to recognize that we're not going to do it through rewards. We can't give external rewards for compassion because compassion is its own reward. And if you start to give external rewards for it, you don't get the real oxytocin running through your system. You don't get the real experience, right? So we need to promote compassion, but not through external rewards. We need to recognize people's capacity for compassion, right? Both adults and children have an immense capacity for compassion because it's hardwired in us. It's part of our being, right? Let me tell you a little story here. It's a story about a man I worked with in the prison system when I used to work in the prison system a while ago now. We'll call him Jason. Jason had this long history of violence. Now, he grew up in violence, and his own personal story is pretty horrific, and I'm not going to give you all the details of that. But he was also violent in his life. He was violent to his partners, and he was violent by profession. What does that mean? He was an enforcer, not for a hockey team, but for drug lords, right? He would break people's legs for a living. And for drugs, I guess. And he was diagnosed as an antisocial personality disorder. And he even knew that he had this diagnosis. He was told many times that you're an antisocial, right? Now, like most men I work with in prison, when I met Jason, he presented with this great deal of bravado, right? This armor of masculinity. But it became clear to me that it wasn't so much bravado, but resignation. It was kind of like, this is my lot in life. I'm an antisocial. This is how I have to live. And there was one question I asked him that basically had a profound impact on both of us, really. And I said to him one day, as we were sitting talking, we can talk about your violence that you've experienced and that you've done for hours and hours and hours. And we will, right? We will do that. But for right now, what I'd like to hear about is the moments in your life that didn't have anything to do with violence, that in fact were opposite to violence. There has to be some moments in your life that were not related to violence. And what he told me, well, You tell me if you were as shocked as I was. He said, well, you know, one thing that I do that's not involved with violence, in a sense, sort of, at least not my violence, is that I rescue animals that other people are abusing, and I nurse them back to health, and then I give them to the SPCA or to people I believe will take care of them. And then I also, I'll do garbage runs sometimes and find things that are broken that people have thrown out but are fixable, and I repair them and then give them away as gifts to people. And then he told me a story about the birth of his daughter when he was clean and sober and first held her in his arm. And he also shared with me about his artwork, both painting and carving that he did, where he was sort of outside of himself, outside of the violence, and just in a state of creation. And so in sharp contrast to the story of violence and destruction and pain, right, was a story of healing, right? A story of creation instead of destruction, right? Of generosity and kindness. And in Jason's case, in any case, he was never violent again after this session. He still struggled with many things in his life, including addiction, but he was never violent again. And allowing that part of him to become visible became the change process for him, right? So we need to recognize people's capacity for compassion and encourage it. And one of the ways we can do that is we can engage and teach in practices of compassion. Compassion meditation practices, loving kindness practices, right? These formal practices that are out there that can be easily taught. And there's even other kinds of ways of doing it. How many people have heard of the Roots of Empathy project, right? Good, a whole bunch of you. It's amazing, right? They bring a baby into a classroom, and what happens? These kids start to interact with the baby. And they start to relate to the baby and to try to understand the baby. And in doing so, they step outside of themselves. They're building skills of relating, of compassion, of connecting with others, right? And the results, of course, have been tremendous, right? And there's other projects. There's the kindness curriculum that was started by Richard Davidson in the States, in the Midwest, right? They do a 12-week program teaching kindness to children. Again, very similar results, right? We also need to encourage opportunities to help each other and to spark curiosity about each other, right? Because the more that we can learn about each other, the more open we become to that, right, the more we connect. How many of you have heard of the Human Library event? Fewer of you. I mean, I think it came from Scandinavia originally, and it's come into Canada. And I heard about it last year in Vancouver, where instead of going to the library and borrowing a book, you go borrow a human being, right? Just a regular person who wants to share their story, and you want to hear their story, right? Isn't that amazing? We can actually learn about each other and share our stories. I mean, I think it's a fantastic idea, and we should do more of that. We also need to promote compassionate flowering. Compassion is actually contagious, right? Not only in the act of compassion does the compassionate person and the receiver release oxytocin, feel a bonding experience, but observing it also does the same thing, and then inspires or energizes the observer to also want to engage, right? And the stories of compassion can be very inspiring. One such story that I've heard about, and it's run through kind of the Facebook circuit, is a story about the Babembo tribe in Zambia. Maybe some of you heard this story. It's somewhat similar to the healing circle idea, but when there's a person in their community that does something wrong, that fractures the community, what they do is they bring that person, they put them into the center, and then the whole community surrounds that person. And they basically tell that person why they're a valued member of the community, what they've done historically, right, that the people appreciate. They don't talk about the act that caused the problem. They talk about how they're a valued person. And according to the stories that I read, this could go on even for 2 days, right, which sounds like a long time, depending on the size of the tribe, I suppose. Now, I don't know if this story is true or not. But I do know a true story where a teacher who heard the story about the Bembembo tribe and who was somewhat skeptical about it decided one day in class, after one of the kids at recess had caused a great deal of problem for a majority of the other children, and when they came back from recess, it was kind of chaos in the classroom and a lot of bad feelings and nobody was paying attention. She decided that she would try this. She would invite the young boy to be in the center of the circle if he wanted, and the rest of the class to share with him positive stories about their relationship with him. And the children took to it. And her report of that was that it was amazingly transformative for the boy, for the class, and then everybody got to work, right? So let's share the stories, right? I do supervision for different groups, and often supervision is about what's not working, right? What's challenging? How do we figure out solutions to problems? And that's great, that's what we need to do that. But one of the things that I always ask people is, what's working? What have you done well, right? What has inspired you? So that we can also share those positive stories rather than just sharing stories where things are stuck, right? Which is also why sometimes I tell people that they need to take news fasts, right? You know what a news fast is, right? Take a couple of weeks off, don't watch the news, right? Because it's not really the news at 6, it's the bad news at 6, right? I mean, they don't give you everything that's going on in the world, they're just telling you what's not working in the world. I mean, we do need to know what's not working, but we can't be inundated with just negative information all the time because it has a real impact on us, even at a level that we don't understand, right? I had these clients who were actually recovering from trauma who all of a sudden came back with trauma full-blown, nightmares back, and there was nothing new that happened in their lives except that they were glued to the news nonstop, 24/7, because of a major event that happened in the world, one of these recent wars that has unfolded. And my only prescription to them was 2 weeks, no news, and the symptoms started to go down again, right? That's how affected we are, right? By information received. So we have to be conscious consumers of information, and that means we have to be conscious, what's the opposite of consuming? Expressors, givers of information, right? And we need to share positive stories as well, because we consume also what we share. And we need to promote compassionate leadership. We need to take opportunities to become compassionate leaders, right? Because that's one of the most effective ways of promoting compassion in any system, right? And the truth is actually increasingly becoming true that compassionate leaders are actually more effective than autocratic leaders in a lot of different fields, including, believe it or not, in the business world. I was surprised to read and happy to read that those who were considered compassionate leaders outperformed on the bottom line in terms of dollars and cents the autocratic leaders 5-1 when they looked at some of the top companies. Now, compassionate leadership basically means having the time or making the time to engage in connective conversations with people. Becoming a compassionate leader is aware of their own feelings and manages their own feelings and is aware of other people's feelings and recognizes the feelings are contagious. And so they work on cultivating the kind of contagion that they want in their system. And they put people before procedures. Compassionate leaders are also active. They move others passionately and purposefully towards shared visions. And compassionate leaders are courageous. They engage in frank, open dialogue about difficult topics, right? It's not about avoiding things, it's about getting in the muck and dealing with what's really going on. But they do this with humility, with respect, with conviction, with what I call a strong back and an open heart. I don't know what that was. So to summarize, intelligent compassion inherently requires connection to the vertical axis. In this way, we work towards creating open states within ourselves and across individuals. And so in this larger space that's created through compassion, we can see our own and other people's humanity more fully. And this means dropping back into the world, dropping back into what matters, to transform what's going on, to transform the problems that exist, to become more creative problem solvers. So we don't try to escape the horizontal dimension of life. What we try to do is engage with it more fully, to see it from a wider angle lens. So compassion ties us back to the horizontal axis without disconnecting us from the vertical axis. It's not about utopia. It's about change, about transformation, about creativity. It's a way of promoting excellence. It involves opening through compassion-based practices and interactions, building networks, alliances, engagements that facilitate transformational experiences, that reconnect us back to the problem from a whole versus parts perspective, leading to skillful action, doing the right thing at the right time, in the right place, by being in the right state. So I'd like to finish with a story, an invitation, and if you'll indulge me, a little exercise that I can do with you, which we'll also complete with another poem. Now, the story you may have heard of before. It's a First Nation story about a grandfather talking to his grandson about how he feels. And he said, I feel as if I have these two wolves fighting in my heart. One wolf is a frightened and reactive one. The other wolf is a loving and compassionate one. And the grandson asks him, which wolf will win the fight in your heart, grandfather? And he answers, the one that I feed. So what I want us to consider as we move forward, as we think about mobilizing compassion to help children and adults thrive in their environments, I want us to think about which wolf we're feeding in our own hearts. Because unless we're good to ourselves, we're really not going to be good for anyone else. But I also want us to pay attention to which wolf we're feeding in the hearts of the people with which we work, in the ways we see them and the ways we interact with them. This also includes the people that we disagree with, right? Even though it might be difficult. Perhaps even includes Donald Trump and people like that. Unless we're willing to work with all people, we won't create open states that allow for change and transformation. So I'll finish, if you'll indulge me, with a little exercise on creating 3 positive connections and a short little poem. And then if there's time, we can take some questions. So please try to sit up a little bit with a strong back and an open heart. Sort of cultivating that attitude as you cultivate the posture. And then closing your eyes, shifting now from thinking to breathing, shifting from any tension to just a simple, subtle, energetic feeling. And begin to connect with your own physical center. And you can find your physical center by just recalling a moment in time where you felt deeply connected with yourself, with others, perhaps with nature, where you felt flowing in the moment. And as you recall that moment, you'll notice how your body is responding to that, how you feel it in your center. And just take a moment to connect with that experience of your own center and breathe into it. And notice how good it feels to connect with your own self. And as you do that, I'd like you to connect with your resources, with your own personal community of care, your community of saints. Think about who loves you, who supports you, who inspires you. And I want you to imagine them around you at this time. It could be living people, it could be ancestors, spiritual beings, it could be nature. Whatever's appropriate for you. Allow yourself to experience them spatially around you at this moment. And let the warm feelings and the power and beauty of the image you've chosen fill you. Allow yourself to feel and rest in these feelings of love, gratitude, and affection. And give yourself the same feeling that you experience from this image. Give yourself that same kindness, the same warmth, the same love. Practice wishing yourself well. You might say something to yourself like, may I be well. May I be at ease. May my life be filled with peace. And just repeating those phrases, wishing yourself well. May I be well. May I be at ease. May my life be filled with peace. And then extending this out to others, to the people in this room, to your own family, friends, colleagues, and perhaps even to the people that you're challenged with at this particular time in your life. Coworkers, students, supervisors, politicians, whoever it might be. Wishing them well as well, that they may be at ease, that they may be filled with peace, that they may be well. And as you do that, I'd like you to create a positive focus for yourself, a positive intention for today and tomorrow, for this time that we've had together and the time that you want to take with you. It could be a simple intention to be present and open from henceforth. It could be to be open to the exchange of new ideas, whatever it is for you that's appropriate. And just repeat your intention to yourself as I read this poem that will help us complete our time together. You hearing this, be ready. Starting here, what do you want to remember? How sunlight creeps along a shining floor? What scent of old wood hovers? What softened sound from outside fills the air? Will you ever bring a better gift for the world than the breathing respect that you carry wherever you go right now? Are you waiting for time to show you some better thoughts? When you turn around, starting here, lift this new glimpse that you found. Carry into evening all that you want from this day. This interval you spent hearing or reading this, keep it for life. What can anyone give you better than now? Starting here, right in this room, when you turn around. Thank you. So, there's 5 minutes left. It's late, but I'd be happy to stick around and answer some questions, and you can come to the mic. It's up to you. Or comments, or criticisms. We take it all. Anything anybody want to share? Yes?
What do you do when an act, an overt act, that is either done to you or by you, that you assume is a compassionate act, is actually taken 180 degrees opposite of the done to?
So what do you do when you've engaged in an action that you experienced, that you believe was compassionate, and the person on the receiving end experienced it as something else? As hostility. Yeah. The first thing I would suggest is to take a step back and try to understand why that person would experience it as hostility. You don't have to assume that you were hostile. I think you need to open to the possibility that that may be the case, that there might have been some underlying thing going on for you. But you don't have to accept that as the truth. But what you can do is open to understanding where that person was at and why they might experience that as hostility. Because it is true that sometimes people engage in actions that they say are compassionate but end up being, colonization, right? that it's about forcing a perspective on someone else based on a pre-assumption that you already know what the right thing is, right? And that isn't compassion. You may think that's compassion, but it's not. But sometimes it's the person's own experience, their own history, that is being triggered. And remember, compassion creates openness, and openness is scary as all heck. So even receiving compassion sometimes can create this reaction in people where they want to close down because they're not used to it, right? And so what happens is there's this kind of impulse to go into protection mode because, the throat is bare. They might see you as the lion coming in to hug them, but they don't know that it's a hug. They might think it's, the jaws are coming. So my answer is to stay open, to stay grounded, and to try to understand what their experience is. And usually when we do that, when we stay open and we try to understand, the energy starts to dissipate and people start to connect and understand each other. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
I have a question about, you said that compassion should be rewarded as its own reward.
Yes.
But where have the children learned the opposite reward that comes from
So positive reinforcement is kind of another, it's almost an act of compassion itself. And so it's not really giving them an external reward like a cupcake for doing something. So that's what I meant. Don't give people, cupcakes for being compassionate. But, acknowledging the truth of the experience, I think, can be a very useful thing, yeah.
So, with the monks, right?
Is compassion in the heart? I think the more, all right, how do I answer that question? Yes, they were right, and no, they weren't. And, compassion lives in the heart and in the brain. And in a sense, these two organs actually interact with each other. And the heart actually has its own neural field, right? Its own neural net. So there's actually a field of neurocardiology that studies the distinct neural net of the heart. So the heart has its own intelligence, and it is a significant zone of understanding about compassion. And compassion is also related to the brain. I think we have to see ourselves holistically. The gut plays a role too. The nerves innervating your gut are the size of a cat's brain. So, you have a little kind of mammal right there, right? Which may not surprise some of you, right? So I think we're more complex than that. The molecules of emotion, according to Kenneth Spirit, actually exist everywhere in our body, including, our pinkies, right? And so we feel holistically, like we feel everywhere in our body. Our whole body feels experiences, right? So the monks were right that in many ways, metaphorically, it's here. There's a physical element that is actually true that it is also here, and it's broader than that, right? Any other questions or comments? We're good? Thank you again very much. Thank you.